this is the repair for the power and your volume switches. This is a repair you'll want to do if you've tried to either volume up or volume down, or your power button, and neither of them work. What happens sometimes is the connection points on the switches will actually break. So you'll want to inspect it, and I use either like an eye loop. You can use a magnifying glass, a microscope, but just ensure that all 5 of these little connection points are actually connected and not broken, because that will happen sometimes where they break and you think the switch is bad, but it's just a small break in the connection, and that can be replaced. All 3 of these switches are the same, so you can buy one switch and it'll work for all 3. So depending on which switch is bad, you can replace it with the same switch. And the other thing is, it's done the exact same way. I'm just going to demonstrate on this switch right here. But if the power or the volume up button, if neither of those work, then you can do this repair the exact same way. So what you'll first want to do is tape the board up. And I just use 3 little pieces of the polyamide heat tape. You can use, probably masking tape or something like that. But masking tape has like a glue is what the adhesive is. This is actually made for high temperatures, so it doesn't melt on the board, which is very nice. Now you'll want to just tape around the switch, ensuring that the connection points are still exposed, but that all the components around the switch are covered, because when you get the heat gun in there, or I'm sorry, the soldering iron and even the soldering wick to remove all the solder, that can actually damage parts of the component. So you just want to be careful when we're soldering that nothing, either the iron or the wick, are touching any parts of the component. But this tape does help to protect it a little bit. Now, one other thing that can happen, and this usually isn't repairable, is the switches can actually rip the connection points off of the board, and if the points where the solder solders to, if those are gone, then typically it's not repairable. So you'll want to inspect all those connection points to make sure that they're still intact. The easiest way to do it is if you look at it and you can see the solder points on there, then you know that point is still good. If it looks like the solder is kind of on a tab, and the little tab is almost like a tape, and if that's removed, then that point is probably damaged. So anyways, if you've checked it all out and you know that the switch is bad itself, then we'll go ahead and start on the repair. So we'll go to the close-up, and I have a little circuit board holder. You can use kind of anything. I mean, you can tape the board down, but if you do tape it down, just remember and keep in mind that the board could be hot, and you don't want to pull the tape off while the board is hot, because what can happen is you can actually pull off any of the components on the board, and then do further damage. So you want to make sure that it cools down all the way before trying to remove any of the tape. Now, these switches have 5 connection points. There's one on this side that's a guide. There's another guide on this side, and those 2 guides actually guide the switch into place. So it lines up exactly where it should. And then these 3 little connection points on the back, you have one right here, you have one right in the middle, and then you have one right there. Those 3 are the main connection points for the switch, and you'd want to make sure, and I'll show you here on the replacement switch, that the soldering points are actually kind of on the outside. And let me get another little pointer here, and I'll point that on these 2 little outside pieces. You have one right there. Oops, sorry. And you have one over on that side. and those 2 points are actually where the solder attaches to. So you want to make sure when you're soldering the new piece on that you get, obviously the piece in the middle and then these 2 little wings on the outside. They're really hard to see, but if you have the switch in front of you, you can look closely, again with a magnifying glass or the eye loop or a microscope, and you can see where those soldering points are. So you have to make sure that that's where the solder attaches to. It's kind of a common problem that happens is people don't get the solder in the right spot, and then they put the switch together and it doesn't work, and that's typically why it doesn't work. So anyways, we'll start removing the solder. Now we're going to use the solder wick. This actually removes the solder off of the board and gives us a clean surface to work with. So all the old solder that's holding that switch in place, the wick is going to remove all of it so we can get the old switch off, put the new switch on, and then reapply new solder. So this just strips all the old solder kind of from where it is on the board. So what we'll do, and it doesn't take much to remove the solder, but you're going to want to remove it from all 5 of those connection points. So this may take you a long time. It may not take you that long. It really depends on your your soldering iron and how clean that tip is, I guess. Now you really want to keep in mind and be careful of the board, because not only your soldering iron but the solder wick again can damage all those little components on the board, and if that happens, then you may cause damage that could be irreversible. So just keep in mind and be aware of what you're touching on the board. Okay. Oop. And it should pop off. It may pop off easy. It may take you a second or two, but once you get the old switch off, we'll just kind of clean up the points on here, and just make sure it's a nice clean surface. You want to make sure that there's no solder sticking up or in the way for the new switch to come on. So again, here's our new switch, and we'll kind of just set it in place. I'll put the soldering iron down. We'll set it in place, and what we're going to do is just kind of work from the outside, and we're going to tack the guide in on one side, and then we'll tack the other guide in, and then slowly work it down so it sits flush with the board, and then we'll attach the 3 back pieces, the connection points, onto it. So all we really want to do is just get it and just be able to tack it in place so it holds nice and firm. Okay, so that's nice. And then we'll move to the other side, and again, being careful of your soldering point. You don't want to touch the board at all, or any of the components on the board. Okay, so I'll use some solder here and just get it and just dab. Whoop! See, that's what happens if you don't tack it in place. Now we're back to square one. Again, this may take a little bit of time, but it's worth taking your time, because if it's done properly, you won't have to keep going back, because that's the worst, if you get it all together and then realize that once you test it, the switch doesn't work at all. Okay, let's see here. Let's re-tack this side in. Okay, that's good. There we go. So once we get this tacked in, okay, now we'll attach the points on the back, and I'll usually start with the center point. And try to turn that so you can see that. I'll usually start with the center point just to get another point of attachment onto the board. Okay, sorry if my hand's covering it. So I'll do that right there. Okay, so there's our center point. And then again, this is probably going to be the hardest spot right here, is to actually attach the two little wings on the left and the right to those 2 points on the board. And if you have issues, I mean, once you solder it, I'd look at it just to make sure that look at it with the eye loop, just to make sure that you've got it right on the right spot. And if you haven't, then you can go back with your soldering wick and remove that solder and redo it. It does get a little tricky trying to solder those 2 little points on, but if you get it just right, usually you can get that soldering point on. So we get it right here. All right. And so there you go. Once you get it all together, you want to test it, and that's how you do the volume switches.